Back to BNC Live, everyone. I'm Laverne McGee. June marks the beginning of hurricane season, and with the pandemic still at the forefront of many people's minds, it begs the question, are people doing enough to prepare for hurricane season?
You're in a hurricane zone. Now is the time to ensure that you have an evacuation plan in place, disaster supplies on hand, and a plan to secure your home quickly.
The Federal Emergency Management Agency is echoing those calls to prepare. And with me now to help unpack some of the challenges the pandemic is bringing as well is former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate. Thanks so much for joining us today, Craig.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Well, let's start by you telling us about one of the main things that FEMA is recommending this hurricane season and that people need to do in terms of dealing with COVID as well.
Get vaccinated. Again, last year we didn't have a vaccine. And so, in asking people to evacuate, there was always concern that people would be more concerned about COVID than evacuation. And we have to remember the reason we evacuate in hurricanes is the threat of drowning. It is water that's the most dangerous part of these hurricanes. So, if you live in these areas that are in the evacuation zone, your plan is to evacuate. And if you're concerned about, where you're going, COVID, that's another reason to be vaccinated now, so that if you do need to evacuate, you're already protected against the virus.
Interesting. Well, Craig, I also want to get your perspective on a survey that's come out by the University of South Florida. The preliminary findings show that 74% of the people surveyed feel at greater risk while being in a shelter than from COVID-19 than from staying in their own home during a hurricane. So what do you say to people who may be thinking about riding out a hurricane at home instead of evacuating to a shelter?
Again, get vaccinated. But even last year, as I would tell people, COVID's bad. Drowning is worse. And last year, a lot of the states took steps to use hotels and motels so that there were very few shelters opened. But if you're worried about going to a shelter, plan ahead. There are a lot of options. Get vaccinated. But the last thing you want to do is ride out the storm in an evacuation zone and then make that 911 call when it's too late and not get rescued.
Yeah, we certainly don't want that happening to people. Let's talk about your time at FEMA. Of course, you know the importance of having these emergency hurricane preparedness kits. Of course, we want to give our viewers news they can use. So tell us about some of those things that people should have in those kits and why, especially during this pandemic.
Well, probably the one thing I recommend for a lot of people, because we're so used to streaming and Wi-Fi and all this great technology that in a hurricane often goes out. So keep a portable radio in your supply kit so you can get updates from your officials and the weather service. This happened to me in Gainesville, Florida after Hurricane Irma. I lost internet, I lost cellular data. The only way I could find out what was going on when the hurricane was striking our community was on a radio. So very basic technology, but can become very handy when everything else is going down.
And how do you feel about these generators? Because people do often get them, but then unfortunately you hear about people not using them properly because they really don't know how to use them. And then they have problems, in their homes because of it. What are your thoughts on these generators that you can buy?
We were seeing this back in Florida as far back as 2004 when you start seeing carbon monoxide poisoning becoming a leading cause of death in a hurricane. That tells us there's something wrong. And it was people running generators who didn't understand that exhaust is deadly. Do not run a generator in your home. Don't run it in the garage. Don't run it in the carport. Get it far away from your home and run the cords in it. And again, this is not something you want to do when the hurricane's threatening. You want to know how to use that ahead of time and do so safely. And strongly recommend getting carbon monoxide detectors in your home. So if there is a leak, you're warned before the tragedy occurs. We have saw and continue to see more deaths from carbon monoxide poisoning, which is entirely preventable when we're talking about hurricanes.
Well, Craig, we're out of time, but thank you so much for all of that helpful information. We appreciate it. Come back and see us sometime. Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator. Thanks for being with us here on BNC Live.